I understand the statistics overall in Africa of churches being destroyed, of Christians being butchered. They're staggering. Can you fill us on the latest numbers?
Going down, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa, this is a nightmare. In Nigeria, where you have a bona fide genocide, just between January and April of this year, you had 1,500 Christians were hacked to death. Now, how many people in the West even heard of that? They heard that about 248 Palestinians were killed.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. As always, let's start with prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Almighty God, through the intercession of St. Ignatius Loyola, we ask that you pour forth your Holy Spirit upon us, a spirit of discernment, they might hear your voice and obey your command. Well, friends, we know that COVID is in the news, and one of the things that has been a leading story is about vaccine mandates. And it's been suggested by Peter Singer of Princeton University that vaccine mandates are like seatbelt laws. So what's the problem? Well, there are more problems than you might think. To help us talk about that today, my returning guest is an author, is a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute Center on Human Exceptionalism. He's also been sounding the alarm on the culture of euthanasia for decades. Wesley J. Smith, welcome back to the Catholic Current.
Thank you, Father McTague. Good to speak with you again.
I know that Professor Singer has been writing on ethics for very many years, and for some people, he's kind of the go-to guy for a great soundbite. And people have asked him about vaccine mandates. Well, they're like seatbelt laws, they're like helmet laws. What's not to like? What issue do you have with that analysis?
Well, in one, you're wrapping a cloth or a leather belt around your body, which doesn't cause any potential side effects. And the other, you're injecting strong body-changing substances into your system, which is almost surely, almost always safe, but not always. And it is an act of, one is a minimal act of inconvenience, and one is a deeply profound act of violation of personal autonomy. And you would think you would need a truly compelling interest to require such an act by people.
Well, it puzzles me, and also, a seatbelt can be undone. A vaccine is forever. You can't ever really become
that's a very good point.
Unvaccinated. I have
once it's in your body, you cannot extract it.
Right, and again, I'm not a healthcare provider. I'm not giving medical advice on the air. That's not my place. I don't know, you're not either. But I think analyzing these things logically and in terms of ethics, there's some head scratching. I know that when I was in New Jersey, I was told that if my dentist was HIV positive and he decided to poke around in my mouth with sharp instruments, I had no right to know his HIV status. If I want to vote, I don't necessarily have to prove my identity, but if I want to eat in certain restaurants on the West Coast, I have to prove my vaccine status. Have you noticed there seems to be kind of wild incongruities flying around these days?
Oh, gosh, yes. And that leads us, we may not want to talk about it in depth, to a much larger problem. And that is we have a crisis of expertise because a lot of times today, what masks as science or expertise is actually ideology. And I think the HIV crisis, looking back, was one of the first times that occurred, because rather than deal with the HIV epidemic, and I was in San Francisco, living in San Francisco at the worst of it, it was one of the most tragic things I've ever seen. It was horrific to see these poor young men, maybe 20, 22, 25 years old, having to be held as they walked down the street by their friends and looking 80. It was something that was a horror. But the fight against AIDS actually almost became a civil rights issue more than a public policy issue, more than a public health issue, as you mentioned, in terms of who gets to know and how and the idea of reporting. And I think we've gone further and further down that road ever since, to the point that just in terms of people gathering back last year in massive numbers, it was either dangerous or it wasn't, depending on which political side was doing the gathering. Remember?
Right. Oh, sure.
And that kind of thing causes a loss of confidence in the experts, and there's a reason people no longer trust experts, and it also causes a collapse in confidence in institutions. Mm-hmm. And it's a very difficult circumstance. Now, Peter Singer, we also have to understand his beliefs. He is a utilitarian moral philosopher, and in my opinion, the term moral philosopher is an oxymoron in his case. Mm-hmm. Because as a utilitarian, he doesn't believe that human life has exceptional value or any unique value whatsoever. He believes that what we need to do is maximize happiness and minimize suffering. And utilitarians do not believe in human rights. They believe in utilitarian outcomes. Mm-hmm. And in this circumstance, he's saying, well, because hopefully and probably the vaccine would reduce the number of deaths, then if people don't like it and they think it's against their rights, that's too bad, because the utilitarian outcome here benefits more people living than not living. That's how he would think about this. But there's more to it than that. And we've seen in this entire pandemic that people like Dr. Anthony Fauci, who, his job really is to focus on, okay, what will do the most to restrict, this pandemic. The decision maker is not Dr. Anthony Fauci, because if Dr. Anthony Fauci becomes the decision maker, it inherently becomes political. And once it's political, it's no longer expert.
Right.
Fauci should give his best, and people like in the FDA and so forth, the CDC, NIH, they should give their best recommendations within the scope of their field, but there are going to be other people also talking to the ultimate decision makers in government, people that'll be dealing with what are the economic consequences, people dealing with, for example, what will be the social consequences for children if they have to be forced out of school for a year and are unable to become socialized. What about the depression and suicides of children? People will have to think about how do we best protect our elderly populations who are most at risk for serious disease. And that's how it's supposed to work. And then the person who, Lincoln was once grousing to a friend about his plight during the Civil War, and the friend said, well, Abe, you're the one who wanted to get on this horse, So the person who, gets on the horse is the one who's ultimately going to have to take all of these various areas of advice and try to come up with a coherent and cogent policy. But what we're doing now is, follow the science, follow the science. Well, science is a process. Right. It's a process of trying to discern facts in the best way, the most accurate facts possible, and it's never settled. So when you say follow the science, you're actually saying interfere with the process, because the process needs to be an ongoing and continuing thing. And
it's not like dogma.
I just am. Yeah, exactly. It's becoming dogma. And you see the dogma imposed by the social media. So the social media, YouTube perhaps, or Twitter, Google, Facebook, will shut down discussions from very learned people with, let's say with expertise in communicable diseases and in viruses, if their thinking does not comport with the current thinking of the CDC. 2 weeks later, the CDC may come around to that position, and then suddenly they can talk on Facebook. It's ludicrous. And it's a real problem that we face today.
Well, yes, I think there is the cult of the expert, and a lot of these experts have clay feet. There was a gentleman from Imperial College who came up with the absolutely horrifying worst case scenario, spread and death, et cetera, wanted lockdowns and every conceivable mandate. And governments acted, and I think ultimately overreacted, in light of a very flawed model. And then he had his married paramour come over from time to time for conjugal visitations. So he was acting absolutely contrary to this hysterical model that everyone else overreacted on. And people who crunched the numbers said, this model was flawed from the beginning. How could it be taken seriously? And How are you not silenced, Wesley, when people say, but if it saves one life? We've got about a minute in this segment left.
Well, but what if it takes more lives in terms of other issues such as suicide, such as broken marriages, such as increased use of opioids, such as alcoholism? This is not a static situation. It's a very dynamic situation. And personal freedom is as important as some of these public health issues. So this is it's a dynamic tension, and it's always going to be relatively fluid, and we have to be able to discuss all of the issues, not just the ones that those with the power to decide want to focus on.
Right, and ultimately, decisions do have to be made in the public sphere, but they have to be made by people who are accountable to the public, which by definition, a lot of bureaucratic experts are not really accountable to anyone. And they, crises come and go, and the experts seem to remain forever. Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Wesley Smith, author and senior fellow at the Discovery Institute. We're talking about our vaccine mandates like seatbelt laws. The next time we're going to ask, should people who refuse vaccination be denied other healthcare treatment? Remember, our rallying cry here at the Catholic Current is Christus Mundo, Mundus Christo, bringing Christ to the world and the world to Christ. We do it because our Lord says so, for the greater glory of God, the love of our neighbor, and the salvation of our own soul. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcasts. Together, we really can take this conversation around the world. We'll be right back. Stay with us. This is Jesuit Father Robert McTague, your daily host for the Catholic Current. Join me on Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern. We'll start with Let's Talk About This, where you and I go through a controversial topic line by line. I'll be analyzing a request from a mother to euthanize her 4-year-old son. We'll end the hour with Weekend Readiness, reviewing the week's headlines in light of the upcoming Sunday scriptures, so that you can be all prayed up for Sunday Mass. That's Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern on the Catholic Current, coming to you from the Station of the Cross and the iCatholic Radio mobile app.
You're listening to the Catholic Current with Father Robert McTague from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Stay connected with the show, our guests and topics, by following the show on Twitter and Gab. Just search for The Catholic Current.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. We've kicked off with this question: are vaccine mandates like seatbelt laws? My returning guest is Wesley J. Smith. He's an author and senior fellow at the Discovery Institute Center on Human Exceptionalism. Wesley, I happened upon a story which led to other stories. You know how that goes. Courtney Chavez of Alaska has multiple autoimmune diseases, a blood clotting disorder, and a bleeding disease. And she receives monthly treatments that have been keeping her alive for these many years. And she's been going to this clinic as a child. Her mother went, and the clinic prides itself on kind of multi-generational medicine. And they just said, oh, you're not getting the COVID vaccine? You're clearly not committed to health, and we're releasing you as a patient. And she's in a sufficiently remote area where she's having a hard time finding someone who can provide the medicine, without which she will surely die. What's your first take on this story?
Well, that's rank abandonment, and it violates in my view, every principle of the Hippocratic Oath in medicine. You don't abandon patients because you think they're not committed to health. Let's take a different issue. COVID always seems to bring out the worst in our, quote, expert classes. But what if somebody had said back in the day, we talked about HIV in the first segment, what if somebody said even today, well, if you're not willing to use a condom, and if you're not willing to take those prophylactic antiviral drugs while you're engaging in, a normal, how can I put this? While you're sexually active, then we're not going to treat your HIV, or we're not going to give you that heart surgery, people would be up in arms, rightly so.
Mm-hmm.
It's not up to the doctor to punish a patient because the patient decides certain aspects of their own personal health regimens. You should no more say no to an AIDS patient because, let's say, they didn't use condoms or they didn't take these drugs if the patient gets sick. Then this woman should be basically given a death sentence for refusing. I'm really kind of shocked about this story. It's the first I've heard of it.
Mm-hmm.
But they're basically saying, if you won't do what we tell you, we don't think you care about your health, and so you're going to die because we're not going to give you the treatment you need. It's not even elective, apparently, from what you're telling me. It's something she absolutely needs to remain living, and they're willing to send her out basically on the ice floe because she refuses to comply with what they think is correct. These are personal value judgments. Right. She might be quite within, I think she's quite within her rights to think, I've got these compromised systems. I'm scared of that jab.
Well, that's what she herself has said.
That in rare cases, the jab can cause side effects that could affect her.
Right, and she said, look, I'm not anti-vaccine as a matter of principle. But she says, once it's in, and precisely because she's got all these blood disorders, and they're seen in some of the more gruesome side effects, terrible problems with clotting, etc. She said, I just want to wait until we have more information. And the doctor has...
How dare she?
How dare she? And again, like I said, I'm not a healthcare provider. I'm not giving medical advice on the air. But isn't it fair to say, Wesley, that the initial data gathering from which the powers and principalities have been making decisions about COVID, some of that initial data collection was corrupt and unreliable, wasn't it?
Well, and the facts have been changing over time very quickly, as a matter of fact, with regard to these vaccines. And I've been vaccinated, so I don't want people to think I'm against vaccines, but I am against mandates. Mm-hmm. When we were first given the vaccines, we were basically told this is the magic bullet, right? Mm-hmm. Chances of getting reinfected are almost nil. The chances of perhaps infecting others are very, very, very rare, very unlikely, huge protection against the disease and so forth. Then as time went on, suddenly we're being told, the efficacy of these vaccines is beginning to fade over time. And, some of the people with vaccines are getting infected, but most of the time they're not getting seriously ill, and that's where we are today. But there have been a few people who have been fully vaccinated who have died from the disease. So that's not a put down of the people who had certain expectations about the disease, although I don't think that they were properly informing people that this is our expectation. It's not a guarantee. You talked earlier about, the model said this or the model said that. The model is just a model. It depends on whatever information you put into it. Mm-hmm. And the models are rarely going to be on point 100% because, you can't predict the future accurately always. But when she's saying, look, these vaccines and the things we're learning about them have shifted just in a few months, I want to wait some more and make sure this is the best course for me in weighing the benefits and weighing the potential burdens. That's what you do with healthcare. Right. If she had said, I just don't think I want cancer surgery, but I will take radiation, would they say, well, we wanted you to have cancer surgery, and so if you won't do the surgery, then you're no longer our patient? Of course not, and they shouldn't do that here. It is a violation of profound violation of medical ethics, and it is an abandonment of the patient who is just trying to make the best benefit versus potential downside decision for herself. And that's the patient's choice. It's not the doctor's choice.
Hey, remember that rallying cry, my body, my choice? Whatever happened to that?
Well, that only applies in certain issues, not on COVID.
I see. Okay. Well, all right. Thank you.
Father, you're being logical. Don't be logical.
It's been a trail of tears my whole life, Wesley.
Yeah, we feel, we don't think. Right. Remember that. If you feel, you'll understand it.
And I suppose that's your truth. so, friends, I'm speaking with Wesley J. Smith, author and senior fellow at the Discovery Institute Center on Human Exceptionalism. We've been talking about our vaccine mandates, like seatbelt laws. Wesley, one of the things that people have jumped up and down recently is that, the FDA has approved the Pfizer injection. So end of discussion. I did a little digging, and we're going to link to this in the show notes. It turns out a business partner of Pfizer has been authorized with an injection called Comirnaty, but the Pfizer injection itself is still under emergency use. So there seems to be some shucking and jiving about how things are being approved or not being approved. And I just learned something fairly recently. I imagine you've already been aware of it. I always thought that the Food and Drug Administration, their budget comes from the federal government, your tax dollars at work. That used to be the case. Now the majority of the budget comes from the pharmaceutical industry that the FDA is supposed to regulate. Does that make you scratch your head and wonder a little bit?
Well, it's the kind of typical dual mandate that you see in a lot of regulatory bodies. For example, I wrote a book on aviation safety with Ralph Nader back in the 90s, and I was really shocked that the FAA had a dual mandate. One was safety, and one was the business welfare of the airlines. Well, the two might come into conflict,
right?
And
okay.
and the dual mandate causes issues. And this sounds like the same thing. But I have a piece coming out that hasn't come out yet. But I'd like to that hopefully I believe will be in First Things. But I want to talk about the reason why I think a mandate is wrong, if I might.
Yes, please.
There are three tribes in this country right now. There's the pro-vaccine, pro-mandate tribe. I mean, we're so badly divided. Mm-hmm. There's the adamantly anti-vaccine and, of course, anti-mandate tribe. Mm-hmm. And then there's my tribe. I'm pro-vaccine. I think these vaccines have been doing a great deal of good. But I'm anti-mandate because I'm pro-freedom and I'm pro-personal liberty. And then when you think about a national mandate for everyone to get vaccinated, that would be unprecedented. There's never been a national vaccine mandate in this country, not for smallpox, which was a much more serious disease than COVID, not for polio, which when I was a boy scared the you-know-what out of me. Because
it's terrifying.
It was terrifying at my age. I remember children my age were in iron lungs because they were so paralyzed. There was never a national requirement for every person in the country to be mandate, and this would be a first.
Right.
It's probably unconstitutional. Mm-hmm. Now, people are touting this case called Jacobson v. Massachusetts, which I've read. And Jacobson v. Massachusetts from 1905 did not deal with a national mandate. It dealt with a law out of Massachusetts that allowed localities to require smallpox vaccines in a local emergency. Mm-hmm. So Cambridge issued such a call, and somebody resisted, and the Supreme Court said, well, it's a federalism case. This is not an interference with your constitutional rights, but understand that the order from Cambridge, Massachusetts that did not impact people in Cape Cod. So it was a very localized requirement based on local conditions. A national mandate would be completely unnuanced. So if you had a state without any real serious outbreak versus one, let's say, that was in a terrible condition, those are different places. And a national mandate, I don't think the Supreme Court would say that that's constitutional. I don't think the government has the power to do that. State and locals might, depending on circumstances. But even then, it would have to be reasonable. You can't, because there's a healthcare emergency, just enact any law that you want. It has to be reasonable based on the circumstances on the ground, and the circumstances from place to place would shift. By the way, in my opinion, this is why President Biden has been pushing the corporations to impose the mandate on their employees and on their customers. Because guess what? No checks and balances, no democratic deliberation. A corporation, in terms of its business practices, can often act arbitrarily. And this is something that I think anyone who believes in individual freedom and personal liberty should be very alarmed about. The idea that we're going to not have government rules and regulations controlling circumstances, but we're going to depend on persuasion to the private sector. You do our dirty work for us.
Right.
And it's very interesting. It's very interesting. Political progressives always do movies where these corporations are in charge and they look askance, and yet this is the very kind of thing they're promoting when they're urging that the corporations force people to take these vaccines at the risk of not being employed or not being able to go to the grocery store and so forth. It's a very problematic circumstance.
And that's what I want to talk about in the next segment is paternalism in medicine and authoritarianism in government. Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with my expert guest, Wesley J. Smith, author, senior fellow at the Discovery Institute Center on Human Exceptionalism. In the next segment, we're going to talk about when medicine and government work against the patient. It's an alarming topic. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Wherever you can find audio, you can find us. Follow us on your favorite platform, write a 5-star review. We need to attract the attention of the algorithm so these conversations get the attention they deserve. Let's take it around the world. Let's do it together. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Stay with us.
This is the Catholic Current from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Catch up on an episode you've missed or share them with your family or friends. The Catholic Current is podcasted wherever you enjoy listening. Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTeigue of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. We're talking about vaccine mandates. Are they like seatbelt laws? My returning expert guest is Wesley J. Smith, author and senior fellow at the Discovery Institute Center on Human Exceptionalism. Wesley, as we ended the last segment, you noted that the government realizes that they might be bumping into some constitutional issues if they have, say, a universal federal mandate for getting the COVID vaccine, but they're encouraging employers and corporations to do that. My research is not the absolute latest, so this might have changed, but the last time I looked, among the employers that are not requiring their employees to get vaccinated are the White House, the CDC, the FDA, the World Health Organization, and the three makers of the vaccines, Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson. Now, that may have changed in recent days, and we'll be happy to be corrected about that. But it just kind of makes my head scratch. I do know that among the employers that is now requiring vaccines of all their employees is the Catholic Archdiocese of Chicago. What do you make of that?
Hypocrisy is part of the human condition.
Yes.
And I just think that the people who are in charge of our institutions and businesses, including the church, of course, people are, flawed, but I think that you have people running on feelings and not rationality. We have to trust people to make the best decisions for themselves. But this whole pandemic has been used to centralize power in the government. I mean, the CDC passing a regulation that you can't have foreclosures. When did the CDC get that kind of power? It's ludicrous. And the idea of creating a corporatocracy where the corporations will enforce public policy through their private sector actions, this is very alarming for people who believe in liberty. And again, getting into the efficacy of the vaccines. What about when there's a mandate, there's no nuance. Just for example, what if somebody has had COVID and has the antibodies, which is a natural immunity? Do they need the vaccine? That's unsettled. Even if in terms of maximizing their health. B, if they took the vaccine when they already have these antibodies, is it potentially harmful? I know of no studies that have determined one way or the other. So I
I
think
think that would be good to know, wouldn't it?
exactly before you get into any mandates. And 3, there is always the option of testing. Testing is a far less intrusive approach. So if you're worried that if you're in let's say a position of in healthcare, or you're in a position where you're having to be around a lot of people and you're worried about people potentially being infectious, have the vaccine or the testing option. You can test people twice a week. That would greatly reduce the authoritarianism that we're experiencing, because a test is far less intrusive than the substance in your body that cannot be extracted, as we've discussed.
And we would also
is very protective.
We'd also have to grow in our confidence of the testing regimen. I mean, the testing that was done a year ago was done at such an extreme degree of sensitivity that you got an awful lot of false positives. So this is part of what's concerning. Here I go, being logical again.
But they've improved since then.
Yeah, and I agree. I agree.
Yeah.
They have improved since
that would
then.
be that if you do a testing or vaccine, that's a much less egregious and imposition than you will get the vaccine.
Right.
And I think that would be a reasonable compromise that would offer people the relative realistic idea that we can keep people who become infected from crowded areas in the workplace. We don't need a mandate.
And this is a trend that didn't start in the past year and a half. It was New York City a few years ago that was going to have a tax on sugary soft drinks. For example, I remember there was a church in New Jersey that brought food to a food pantry or a homeless shelter in New York City, and regulations required that the food be put in the trash because the fried chicken was fried in trans fats. So there seems to be the idea that there are bureaucrats who know better than you do. So it's better to let these people go hungry than let them have fried chicken that was cooked in trans fats. Does it concern you that I'm from the government, I'm here to help, and you have no choice? That trend seems to be gaining momentum in my eyes. What do you think?
Oh gosh, yes. And the justification is wellness and health. So that is becoming the excuse for authoritarian impositions. I have actually seen, and this is the utilitarianism that Peter Singer exhibits coming out throughout bioethics, unless somebody's a Catholic bioethicist or something like that. You see this kind of being proposed in public health. I've seen proposals that hasn't happened yet, that if you're a smoker and there's a resource limitation, we will deny you surgery. Or we will deny, if you're obese, that one's certainly there. We will deny you particular interventions because you are causing the health care yourself and you're imposing on us with your sicknesses. They never say that about promiscuity. And promiscuity costs a lot of money in healthcare. It leads to venereal disease. It leads to HIV, which is another form of venereal disease. It leads to depression and breakup of relationships. It can lead to suicide. It can lead to pornography addiction. It can lead to unwanted pregnancies, which then lead to potential for abortions and things of this sort. Promiscuity is a very major public health issue, in my opinion.
Yes.
But we don't see these kinds of authoritarian impositions based on that. And I don't think we should either.
Right.
But I just want us, as you pointed out, they're very selective in where they want to go authoritarian. If it's an activity that they endorse or that they don't think is a problem, they stay away from it, particularly if the people who would be impacted have political power or culture power in the society. Right. So somebody who's obese people have very little power in the society, and people look down their noses at people, particularly the morbidly obese. But promiscuity is celebrated at the highest levels of popular culture.
Right, right, and it also seems to me, when the COVID interruption began, and Governor Cuomo asked for certain emergency powers, he asked for them for
Ex-Governor
14
Cuomo.
months. Ex-Governor Cuomo, it was 14 months. Well, how did he know back then that he would need 14 months of special powers? And a lot of these emergency powers, even governors who have said, "Well, the emergency's passed, but I'm having the powers in my back pocket, just in case." It's been my observation in human history that when government seizes power, it almost never ever gives it back. And I think that the COVID, which honestly really does kill some people. It's not imaginary, but I think it's become a gift from the gods for people who want to expand the intrusive power of the state. That's my take. Do you think I'm being alarmist on that, Wesley?
There's there's no question in my view, and it's going to get worse. And let me explain. COVID will eventually pass. All pandemics do, but there now are advocacy for an international response to prevent the next pandemic that comes down. So we've had this catastrophe, which by the way, I believe could have been less catastrophic than it has been. But let's leave that aside. Dr. Anthony Fauci, who, by the way, I think should stop being the face of fighting COVID because so many people don't trust him anymore. But that point aside, wrote last year in a journal called Cell, which is a medical journal, that he believed that the United Nations and the WHO, the World Health Organization, should have their powers increased so that we could, and this is a quote, rebuild the infrastructure of human existence. That's his words. He co-authored this piece. In other words, it isn't because of COVID. He said we're entering the pandemic era, and we need to prepare to prevent future pandemics. And the way he would do it would be centralizing, basically rule by experts, centralizing all decision making in these kinds of international bodies. And he basically is saying we have to rechange the way we build our homes. We have to change the way we involve ourselves in entertainment. I mean, it's an all-encompassing centralization of the entire world society based on the panic and fear of future illness. And that is a real concern. And the fact that he didn't get a lot of pushback from that piece, other than from a few commenters like me, if people want to go to the Epic Times, I wrote a piece on that in which I describe at length what he advocated. It's very worrisome. So with this catastrophe, even when it passes, it will become the pretext for future authoritarianism unless we say, no, we're going to maintain our Republican form of government, our democratic processes, our checks and balances. We're not going to authorize a corporatocracy that can act arbitrarily. When there's a definition for when the private sector is harnessed by the government to do the government's bidding, and that's the true definition of fascism. I'm not talking Hitler, but I'm talking about economic fascism. Is when the private sector is the spear, if you will, for government policy, and that's what we're in danger of. You see fascism right now in communist China. Communist China isn't really communist anymore; it's fascist, because the Chinese leaders said, well, communism, we can allow some free market principles, so there's entrepreneurship. I've been there. I was in Shanghai in 2016. I could have been in Beverly Hills. Versace stores, Cartier. I mean, it was unbelievable. And because the communists they're still called the Communist Party, permitted free market principles, that the living standard of the people was increasing, but their political freedom wasn't. In fact, it's been getting worse and worse, so that the Communist Party forces the private sector, including American corporations, to cooperate with the party when the party wants information. You have to share with the party various data and so forth. So you have a true fascist system in China that allows free market principles to improve living standards, but also has the private sector doing the government's bidding for the government's purposes of control. Very dangerous stuff. And instead of China looking more like us, which was what our, quote, experts, close quote, were betting when we aided and abetted the Chinese increase in standard of living, we're beginning to look more like China.
You know, I agree with you. I mean, real fascism, as I said, is corporations being the cat's paw or the tip of the spear for the state. Ultimately, it becomes the comprehensive surveillance state. And there is no zone of privacy left at all. And that's not a moral house that I would want to live in. Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue my conversation with Wesley J. Smith, author and senior fellow at the Discovery Institute Center on Human Exceptionalism. We're talking about vaccine mandates. Are they like seatbelt laws? In the next segment, we're going to ask, what can the ordinary person do? After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Be part of the conversation. Follow what we're following by following us on Gab. That's gab.com. Our channel is The Catholic Current. We want you to take this conversation to your family and friends, and together we'll take it around the world. We really can do it together. We certainly cannot do it without you. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Please do stay with us.
Jesus 911, weekdays at 2 p.m. Eastern.
My name is Jesse Romero. I'm a retired Los Angeles cop. I'm a Catholic lay evangelist. My show on spiritual warfare is called Jesus 911, where you got 3 retired LA cops, Ruben Nava, Eddie Chavez, talking about the Catholic faith and teaching you spiritual warfare, how to defend yourself against the devil, the world, and the flesh.
Jesus 911, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, on the Station of the Cross and the iCatholic Radio mobile app. After today's broadcast, go to the Catholic Current show page on thestationofthecross.com for info on today's guests, the show resource links, and to sign up for our weekly email of upcoming shows.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTeigue of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. We're talking about COVID vaccine mandates. Are they like seatbelt laws? My returning expert guest is Wesley J. Smith, author and senior fellow at the Discovery Institute Center on Human Exceptionalism. You know, Wesley, growing up, I'm sure you heard this statement too, you can't fight City Hall. But the other day I found an amusing news story. Apparently, at least in Paris, you have to reveal your vaccine status before you're allowed to eat indoors at a restaurant. So what a lot of people are doing is they're setting up picnic lunches outside of the restaurant, basically saying, good luck with that. You know, we're doing just fine.
Saw that story. Yeah.
Are there things that ordinary people can do to push back against the bio-tyrannical state that's forming before our eyes?
Oh, yeah, I think so. First off, with regard to vaccines, people should investigate it and decide for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you and I, as you said more than once on this show, are not doctors. We're not telling people to take it or not to take it.
Mm-hmm.
This is a personal decision. I have taken it. I think that they help, but people have to decide that for themselves. Secondly, this is still a free country. The word still.
Right.
And I do believe that people have the power to actually ensure that policies are not enacted that they oppose. We've had too much lethargy among the people. We've had too much people saying, okay, you just decide. If people are getting active, they can make a change. And another issue, for example, on the teaching of critical race theory in the schools, you actually are seeing people getting involved, and you actually are seeing pushback, and you actually are seeing some of that pushback being successful. So people need to engage. We live in a free country, and that is not only gives us rights, but it gives us responsibilities. And our responsibility as a free person in a free country is to engage when there's an issue of this kind of import. So we do have that capacity. We can also write letters to the editor. We can write letters to these corporations and say, don't you try to force a mandate on me, I'll go to someplace else, and so forth and so on. We can engage if we think the policies are wrong in peaceful protest. So I don't think that we're yet in the circumstance that we're helpless. When I was in China, as I mentioned before, I went and saw the Three Gorges Dam, which was a marvel of the world. And I was talking to one of the tour guides, and she said the first we heard that this dam was going to be built was when we read it in the newspapers. And I realized in China, what the government does is like the weather. They can't do anything about it. If it's going to be cold, all you can do is put on a coat. That's not true here. Mm-hmm. And the only way it would ever become true here is if we let it happen.
Right.
So I still believe in the democratic way, the American way, participate, engage, talk to your friends, go to the meetings of your go to, for example, the town hall of your House of Representatives member. Make sure you vote. There's just so much we can still do that I don't think there's any excuse for us to say, oh, well, we can't beat City Hall. It's not easy. No, but it can be done.
Right. Well, I think, throughout the summer and as the school year was the beginning of the school year was approaching, more and more parents going to school board meetings. When I was growing up, I don't recall my parents ever going to a school board meeting. It just wouldn't have entered their head. It just they didn't think about it. I mean, I'm not pointing fingers. It's just a statement of fact. Is that the kind of thing that you recommend, if you've got kids in school, you need to start going to school board meetings and you need to start holding people to account?
Yeah, because when you and I were growing up, the schools were different.
Oh gosh, yeah.
They were not trying to impose these kinds of woke ideas on children. Mm-hmm. However, as I recall growing up, my mother was the head of the PTA for a period of time. There was tremendous participation by parents in the PTA.
Right.
So there was a great deal of interaction between the schools and the parents in a very cooperative way. There was not the kind of adversary relationship that has recently developed because these schools are trying to impose policies that many people think, and I agree, are antithetical to proper learning and antithetical to creating a society that is based on universal human equality, which of course is our goal and our desire.
Right.
So yes, people can and should engage. They should get to know their teachers. That's a little further afield from what we've been talking about. But in terms of public health policy, they can make their voices heard. They can write letters. They can engage with letters to the editor. They can participate in protests. They can meet with their local legislator. The local legislator will have town halls. You can call your local legislator. You can make people know that you're watching. Mm-hmm. It takes work.
Yes.
Being free takes work.
Yes, it does. It's a high maintenance venture.
We shouldn't complain. Yeah.
No, I agree. There is so much more that can be done and that needs to be done, and we have an obligation to be well informed. I know there are some folks who find it overwhelming to keep up. I mean, I have friends that say, Father, I've got dinner to make. I've got young kids to take care of. I can't be plugged into the news 24/7. Isn't part of the problem, though, is that people can be easily either misled or frightened by headlines?
Well, I think that's a cop-out.
Okay.
Ask next time someone says, Father, I just can't stay that up on current events. Ask them if they know who Kim Kardashian is.
Alas.
Ask them the last time they read People magazine. And I'll bet you they'll know who all the not always, but who all the celebrities are and so forth. We have a frivolous culture that we've all fallen prey to. I'm guilty as other people. Mm-hmm. But it's not, in fact, it is easier to find what's going on in the news. You find a couple of reliable news sources, and I would vary them in terms of their ideological angle so that you have a better understanding of what's going on. We can prioritize knowing what's happening, particularly with particular issues that engage us. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we can't know everything about every issue, and we can't become doctors. But we can on the issue of vaccines. There's so much being distributed, even past the censors of YouTube and Twitter,
Right.
that you can find out the various advocacy sides and the various data that is coming out if you care enough. If you don't care enough, well, then you don't care enough. But don't say I can't. You can. You choose not to.
Right. I think it does become a matter of priority, of time and attention and focus. And yes, it can be overwhelming. But there are really reliable guides out there. And I want people to check out our show notes. And certainly, Wesley, we're going to link to your very good work. We've got about 30 seconds left. Where else can our listeners find your work?
Discovery, www.discovery.org, the Center on Human Exceptionalism that I chair. We get into all of these various sanctity of life, human dignity issues. And I stay on Twitter because a lot of people like to read my articles, so I post them all on Twitter, and I have a Facebook page. I post them all on Facebook. I have not yet been censored, so if people are interested in what I write, please follow me on Twitter or follow me on Facebook.
Wesley J. Smith, God bless your good work. You've been a longstanding advocate for life. I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, Father. Always good to talk with you.
I'm Jesuit Father Robert McTague, your host every day here at the Catholic Current. Join us tomorrow. We have our Friday format. We begin with Let's Talk About This. I'll be reviewing a woman's request to euthanize her 4-year-old son. And then it will be Weekend Readiness, where I review the headlines of the week in light of the upcoming Sunday scriptures so you can be all prayed up for Sunday Mass. Take this conversation to your family and friends, and together we'll take it around the world. Through the intercession of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, may mighty God bless you. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, go in peace, and please pray for me.
Thank you for listening to this podcast brought to you by the stationofthecross.com, a listener-funded nonprofit organization. Please prayerfully consider donating at thestationofthecross.com by calling 1-877-888-6279 or through our free iCatholic Radio mobile app.